Well, good evening. My name is Thorin Tritter. I am the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County, located in Glen Cove, New York. Welcome to our program. I'm particularly excited about our program tonight with the award-winning science journalist Melinda Wenner Moyer, who has just published a new book with the provocative title that you see on the screen, How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Assholes. And we'll be talking this evening about things we can do to prevent racism among our children. Before we get to the presentation this evening, however, I do want to, as always, put in a plug for some other upcoming programs. Tomorrow at 11 a.m., I will be holding my next Curator's Corner, where I give a short presentation about individual objects and images in our collection. Tomorrow, I'm going to be talking in particular about a photo that we have in one of our galleries that shows a theater troupe performing at the Feldafing Displaced Persons Camp in 1947. And I'm going to talk about Feldafing as a displaced persons camp and about some of the people that are represented in the photo. I also want to mention another book talk that we have scheduled in September. Did I have the right date up there? September 14th. I guess I put it wrong in my notes there. A discussion with Professor Leah Garrett about her new book, X-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos of World War II, a fascinating book that for some reason tells a story that was not out there, but is a fascinating story. And one more program on Wednesday, September 22nd, a little bit down the road, we are holding a fashion show and luncheon at the Pine Hollow Club to raise funds to support our educational and public programs. We've got various levels of tickets available, but it should be really a lovely event, and I hope you'll consider buying a ticket. You can find details about how to buy tickets and more information about all these programs and our full schedule on our website at www.hmtcli.org, and then click the events tab. Okay, enough of the advertisements. Let me pull that down and get to our program tonight. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Melinda Wenner Moyer. Melinda is a contributing editor at Scientific American magazine and a regular contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other national magazines and newspapers. She's also a faculty member in the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program at NYU's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. She's received numerous awards for her work, including the 2019 Bricker Award for Science Writing in Medicine, a 2018 Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellowship, as well as other awards from the American Society of Journalists and Authors, among others. Last month, she published her first book, How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Assholes, which has received wide praise and has been featured on WNYC, The Atlantic, Scientific American, a range of publications. I liked one reviewer who succinctly captured the essence of the book, at least as I thought, who wrote, "How can parents raise kids who believe in themselves and in building a better, more compassionate future? This book provides the roadmap." The book covers a lot of material, but I asked Melinda if she would focus her talk today on some of the information that she shares about how to prevent children from becoming racist. One more comment before I pass the microphone over to Melinda, and that is just to encourage you, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function of Zoom, type them in, and we will make sure to get time where we can have some of that discussion at the end of Melinda's presentation. So that's the layout of our plan. Melinda, thanks very much for joining us, and I pass the screen to you.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited and very honored to be here. I hope you all can hear and see me okay. So that introduction was lovely. I was going to start by talking a little bit about myself and my work, and I will keep it brief because I think you already have been introduced to me. But yes, I'm a science journalist. I have been for 15 years. I cover all sorts of issues in science and health and medicine. And I've been largely freelancing, so that's why I write for a range of different publications. I also have two children. I have a 10-year-old son and a 7-year-old daughter. And when my son was born, I realized that I had a lot of questions that I had no idea how to answer. And so I started writing a science-based parenting column for Slate in 2012, soon after, or I think in maybe 2011, actually, soon after he'd been born, because I didn't know where to get answers to the questions I had, and I felt like science was the best place to look. So fast forward to about 2018. And I was still writing my Slate column. And I started getting increasingly frustrated by the bad behavior that I was seeing around me. If you remember, that was around the time that a lot of Me Too allegations had come to light. There was just a lot of behavior that I felt like maybe my kids were being exposed to, maybe my kids were hearing about, including a lot of racist comments and a lot of hate speech. There was actually a swastika drawn on a building behind the school where I live. And I just started thinking a lot about my kids and what they were learning from what they were seeing and who they were going to become. And I realized that what I wanted more than anything else was for my kids essentially to not grow up to be assholes. And so that's where the book came from. And I realized other parents were thinking the same thing, whereas we used to be really worried about ensuring that our kids succeed and get into the right college. And believe me, I still worry about those things. I really felt like what was pressing was to ensure that my kids grow up to be good human beings. And so to write the book, I dug into tons of science on the development of character and what kinds of parenting approaches shape different character traits and values in kids. And honestly, a lot of the science I uncovered was surprising. And I have to say that especially the science on raising anti-racist kids, that was among the most surprising research I came across, because it really challenged, I think, a lot of the instincts that I had, and that I think a lot of, especially white parents have about what they should be doing surrounding anti-racism and talking to kids about race and racism. So I'm excited to share this science here with you. And I also just want to preface this by saying I'm really in my book talking mainly to white parents because I am a white mother. I don't have the lived experience of parents of color. And so, I don't feel very comfortable giving advice to parents of color on how to talk to their kids about race. But also, I think white parents have the most to learn. And in fact, the science suggests that white parents have the most to learn in terms of what's truly constructive in the ways that we talk to our kids and engage with our kids about race. So first, I want to talk a little bit about what white parents tend to do when it comes to race. And the research does show this to be true. It's not just my opinion. And why it's not very constructive. So white parents often approach the issue of race by thinking of raising their kids to be colorblind. So it's very well intentioned. It's this idea that, okay, if you don't talk about race, if you don't talk about skin color, then maybe kids won't notice it. They won't make a big deal out of it, and they won't become racist. And it kind of makes sense. There's a certain logic to this. As part of the research for my book, I surveyed more than 80 parents, and I asked them whether their kids had ever done or said racist things. And a number of parents said no, and went on to say that in their opinion, their kids were essentially oblivious to skin color. One parent said, "My kids don't seem to mention or notice differences." And I remember another parent saying that her son just doesn't notice race at all. So this is a common idea and belief that white parents have, but the research really contradicts this. Kids do see race, even if you don't think they do, and even if they don't talk about it with you. And I will talk a little bit about the reasons why they might not talk about it with you, but it involves the fact that they sense from us that it's not a topic we like to talk about. But research really shows that babies as young as 3 months old can and do see skin color differences and racial differences. And in fact, babies will prefer looking at faces that share the skin color of their caregivers. So not only can babies actually see race, but they show some preferences at a very early age based on what they can distinguish. The research on toddlers and preschoolers and what they notice about race is a little bit hard for me to talk about because it's really kind of shocking, actually. But I'm going to just share a couple of things with you. So in one study, developmental psychologist Phyllis Katz, she followed about 200 babies and their families, half Black, half white, over the course of 5.5 years, and observed their behavior and conversations as they went about their lives. And she summarized what she saw this way. She said, it's fair to say that at no point in the study did the children exhibit the Rousseau type of colorblindness that many adults expect. So among other things, she also did some interactive studies with these kids. And when she showed 3-year-olds photos of children of different races and asked who they would like to be friends with, she found that 1/3 of the Black children chose only photos of other Black kids, but 86% of the white kids chose only photos of other white kids. In another study, sociologists observed students in a diverse urban preschool for just under a year, and they heard 3- and 4-year-olds saying really disturbing things like Black people are not allowed on this swing, only white Americans can pull this wagon. One child said, you're the same color as rabbit poop. There were some mentions of the Nword. And I just want to say some of this research is a little bit older, but in talking to some of the parents I did for my book, a handful of parents said that they had recently heard kids using the N-word. So this is not something that has gone away. And when these researchers then told the parents that, for instance, their child said, you're the same color as rabbit poop, these parents were mortified. These parents didn't think that their kids ever would say something like this. And they said, my kids have never spoken about race this way at home. And there's more research. I don't need to hit you over the head with it, but more and more recent research as well, where white parents say, I'm certain my kids don't have prejudices, racial prejudices. But then when researchers actually test the kids and give them tests designed to assess their levels of racial prejudice, they find that these kids actually do harbor prejudice. They say blatantly sometimes they wouldn't want to have Black friends. So the reason I'm sharing this is not to upset you, although I know it's upsetting, but just to remind you that even if kids aren't mentioning race in front of you, that doesn't mean that they aren't noticing it. They are noticing it, and they could be forming biased opinions, and they could be sharing them with their peers. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about why that is. It's not because you're a bad parent. It is not because your child is a bad kid. It's because of how children's brains work. So it has to do with how they interpret what they see and hear and how they use those interpretations to build social frameworks. So I'm going to talk about that more in a minute and explain how all of this kind of fits together. But the idea here is that our instincts to address the way that we address racial issues with our kids, which is essentially to not talk about race and not address race with our kids, ultimately what the research suggests is that ends up making kids more biased and not less. Some of you may be hearing me talk and thinking, I'm off the hook because I definitely talk to my kids about race. And that's fantastic. That's true. But I will say also what the research suggests is that there are a lot of parents who think they talk to their kids about race, but actually their kids don't realize that they're talking to them about race. So a lot of times when we talk about race, we use these kind of platitudes like, we should treat everyone the same, even if they look different from us. And we think that's very clearly referring to race, but kids don't necessarily get that we're referring to race. And there's research that suggests that even when white parents are asked to talk to kids about race, they really have a lot of trouble doing it. There was a study published in 2011. It's been covered a lot, actually. So you may have heard of it. Bridget Vittrup, who's a developmental psychologist now at Texas Women's University, she and a colleague asked white parents to talk about race with their 5 to 7-year-old kids as part of a study. And these white parents signed on and said, yep, sure, we will do this over the next 2 weeks and come back and tell you how it went. And the time went by and the parents came back and 90% of them said, I did not have a conversation with my kids about race. I couldn't do it. And a lot of them just said, I'm out of this. I can't do this study. So 10% of those parents who were explicitly asked to talk to their kids about race still could not do it. And here's one more, I love talking about studies. I hope this is okay. One more study that kind of illustrates just the extent to which we try to avoid the topic, even when it's like in our face. There was a study that researchers conducted where they videotaped mothers as they read 2 race-themed books to their preschoolers. One book was called David's Drawings, which is a book about a Black boy who creates pictures with the help of a diverse group of friends. And the other was, What If the Zebras Lost Their Stripes, which you may be familiar with. Actually, you may be familiar with both of these, which is a book that asks questions about what would happen if some zebras were all white and some were all black, and including questions like, could black and white friends still hold hands? So these books are clearly designed to encourage conversations about race and encourage, kids and parents to think about race. But when the researchers videotaped these moms reading these books, they found that none of the moms paused the reading to talk about race while reading David's drawings. 11%, only 11% mentioned interracial friendships when they were reading What If the Zebras Lost Their Stripes? And here's the thing that really gets me. When kids stopped their moms and asked them questions in the middle of their moms reading the books, asked them specific questions about race, they found that the moms avoided answering them or completely changed the subject. So some of them would allude to race and say things like, we should treat everyone equally, or even if we look different, we're all the same on the inside. But rarely did the mothers explicitly talk about skin color and refer to it and talk about racial differences. And again, this is a problem because kids really may not interpret these vague references to race as really being about race. So again, white parents avoid the topic of race in part because they think it's constructive and they think it's helpful. They think it'll be useful if their kids grow up colorblind. And I, again, completely understand this instinct because I had it too. And I also think white parents avoid the topic because it's really hard to talk to kids about race. We have all been socialized, probably raised in families where talking about race is just not something you do. It's taboo, it's uncomfortable. You think talking about race is a bad thing. So we just don't have practice and we feel very uncomfortable with it. We're afraid we'll make mistakes. And I have to say, in researching the chapter for my book on this topic, and I had to do a lot of interviews with researchers, both researchers of color and I mean, all kinds of researchers and mothers, et cetera. I was very apprehensive. I was worried I would use the wrong words. I would ask a question in an offensive way. And I think these are really natural fears that we have. But it gets easier the more you do it. And it's okay to make mistakes. I feel like this is one of the themes of my book. It's okay to make mistakes as a parent, but really what matters is that we try to make the effort. So I've already kind of laid the groundwork to why colorblind parenting isn't helpful, but I just want to highlight one other finding that really shows that actually, yes, colorblind parenting fuels prejudice, and talking about race does the opposite. In that study I mentioned, Bridget Vittrup's study, where 90% of the parents wouldn't talk to their kids about race, she nevertheless analyzed results among the 10% of white parents who talked to their kids about race over the course of a few weeks. And she gave them tests that were designed to assess their levels of racial prejudice in the kids. And then she had a control group of parents who she didn't ask to talk about race with their kids. She found that over the course of the study, the kids whose parents had conversations with them did become less prejudiced over time, and that they were less prejudiced at the end than were the parents who never talked to their kids about race. So, this is one study, and I will talk about a few others, that illustrates that having these conversations, even if we do it imperfectly, they do make a difference and they do really help. So I want to talk a little bit now about why it is that white kids will develop racial prejudice if we don't talk to them about race, because I think this isn't necessarily obvious. I mean, why would that happen? Why wouldn't they just ignore skin color or not make a big deal out of it? So first, I think it's important to know kids, one of their big jobs is to figure out how the world works. They are wandering around with little detective hats on, and they're trying to figure out, okay, which social categories matter? Why does the world look the way it does? What should we be paying attention to? And so they're observing how different attributes play out in society and whether or not they seem important. So they'll notice, for instance, that hair color doesn't really seem to matter when it comes to where people live or what kinds of jobs they have or how wealthy they become, or height doesn't matter. All sorts of things that are, part of our physical attributes, they don't seem to matter. But they see that race matters, because race, as we can all see if we look around, we can see that race is related to all sorts of important outcomes. So kids can see that all but one US president has been white. They can see that, in fact, many people in positions of power and prestige and and who have a lot of money are white. The students at their schools, maybe with the nicest houses, are white. The heroes and doctors portrayed in movies tend to be white, although that is changing, I will say, and I'm very happy about that. And they also noticed de facto segregation. They see people of different races and ethnicities often live in separate neighborhoods. They see that schools are often majority white or majority Black. And so this tells them, okay, race clearly means something. It's important in some way. And they see this racial hierarchy as well. And yet nobody is talking to them about it. They notice, like, my parents aren't talking to me about this, even though clearly, and my teachers maybe, even though clearly race is important in some way. So that actually adds to the intrigue in a way, like, oh, well, race matters. It's also clearly a secret, which means it's like extra super important, right? So kids notice these things, and they notice this hierarchy, and then they start to make inferences about what they're seeing. And that's especially true because we don't give them an explanation. So they think, okay, there's got to be a reason that white people have more power and more prestige. And if no one's going to tell kids why that is and how racism plays into that hierarchy, kids will kind of naturally come up with a biased reason. They will start to think that white people are more privileged because they're smarter or more powerful or just better. So that is one key way in which kids come to the belief that white people are better than people of color. But there are other psychological tendencies that kids and adults sometimes engage in. One is essentialist thinking, which is kids will assume that superficial differences, like differences in skin color, reflect deeper innate biological differences. So you may have heard kids saying that they think that people of different races have different color blood. This is a clear manifestation of essentialist thinking. They also use what's called transductive reasoning a lot. So that means they see false connections between unrelated things. So they will think when people are alike in one way, they're probably alike in other ways too. So they might think, well, everybody who is Black is kind of equally smart or capable. They group people together by physical attributes. And of course, that fuels the development of stereotypes that all Black people are one way, all white people are another way. Then we have in-group and out-group bias, which I'm sure you've heard of. Kids and adults fall prey to in-group and out-group bias, but that's the idea that we prefer people who are members of the group that we belong to. So it explains patriotism and school pride, but it also fosters racism because kids can look around and say, well, this kid looks like me, so I'm going to hang out with him more. And this kid doesn't look like me, so I'm going to keep my distance. And finally, there's high status bias. And this is a bias that we all show, which means we show preferences for groups of people in society that are powerful. High status bias comes into play too with Black kids. So it's not just white kids who are showing biases, racial biases. When researchers study Black children, they find that Black children actually harbor biases against Black people. And this is, I find this research really heartbreaking, but in one study, researchers interviewed Black children of different socioeconomic backgrounds about their opinions about various jobs. And the kids ranked jobs that were typically held by Black adults as lower in status than jobs typically held by white adults, which isn't terribly surprising given that this hierarchy does exist in society. But when the researchers made up fake jobs and illustrated to the kids that these fake jobs tended to be held by Black adults, the Black kids still ranked them as inherently lower in status than made up jobs that were supposedly held by white adults. So in other words, these Black kids believed, and this is thought to represent a lot of Black kids, believe that jobs are inherently less prestigious solely because they are held by Black people rather than by white people. And there are other studies as well that have looked at implicit biases, which are kind of like, whereas explicit biases are biases that people kind of openly can admit to having if they say, oh, I like this person better and this person has white skin compared to that person who has dark skin. There's also implicit biases, which reflect kind of attitudes and associations that people have that reflect kind of beliefs on an unconscious level. Researchers have found that whereas Black and white kids both prefer their own races on explicit bias tests, Black children often do not show an implicit pro-Black bias. They will sometimes actually show an implicit pro-white bias. So this just kind of goes to show that Black kids infer based on what they're seeing that Blacks are inherently less worthy and valuable than white people. So these biases and these observations affect everyone. So I've talked a lot about these really bad and disheartening studies and what you shouldn't be doing as a parent. So I think next I should talk about what we should be doing and what does the science say on how we interrupt the development of these prejudice ideas and stereotypes. And I'm going to kind of break it down into a few different categories. First, I want to talk about conversations, the kinds of conversations we can have with kids that can be helpful. So first, I'll start with a scenario that you might one day find yourself in or have found yourself in with your kids, which is, let's say you're in a supermarket and your child points to a Black woman who's walking by and says something like, "Whoa, her skin is so dark," or, make some comment about her appearance because she looks so different. In that moment, a lot of white parents will kind of shush their kids and sort of shame them for talking about skin color. They might say, "Shh, we don't say things like that to our child." And this is understandable because, again, our culture has taught us that race is a taboo subject, and we are deeply uncomfortable by our kids making racial comments in the middle of a grocery store. But the problem is, when we shame our kids for mentioning skin color, we're essentially communicating to them that skin color is bad, that race is bad. It's a taboo topic. It's telling kids, they shouldn't come to you with questions or thoughts on the topic because you don't want to talk about it. And so that's not necessarily a very constructive response, even though it's a very natural one, I think that a lot of us would have. Another way parents might respond is to kind of minimize the child's observation, to sort of indicate it's not actually important. And they might say something like, "Oh, well, honey, skin color doesn't matter. We're all the same on the inside." So, this child is saying, "Look at the skin color difference." And then you're saying, "That's not relevant. You shouldn't talk about it." So again, it's a sort of similar, it's not as overt, but it's a similar sort of way that we might sort of belittle their observation and make them feel a little embarrassed for bringing it up. We have to keep in mind that kids have already noticed usually by that age that race is important. And so when we tell them, "No, no, no, honey, it's not important at all," it's confusing to them. And again, we're kind of indicating, "Don't talk about this with us. I don't want you to come to me about anything related to skin color again." And that's not really something we want either, because if our kids don't talk to us about race, they're going to talk to their friends. They're going to learn things from the media. We want to be the ones having conversations with them. So what is kind of the best approach in that scenario? I talked to a bunch of race scholars on this, and essentially they said, okay, first of all, take a deep breath, because you're probably very uncomfortable by what your child said. It's probably made you very nervous. So try to calm yourself down a minute. And then you want to respond to your child in a non-shaming, non-angry, calm way, where you say maybe, "Yes, her skin is darker than ours, isn't it? Skin comes in all sorts of colors, and that's wonderful." And then you could even, if you wanted to, explain why. You could talk about the science of skin color. You could say, well, everyone has a chemical in their skin called melanin, and it protects against UV radiation from the sun. And if you have a lot of melanin, your skin's dark. If you have only a little, your skin is light. And how much melanin you have depends on how much your parents had and on where your ancestors lived. So you're really trying to give a matter-of-fact answer that opens the door to your kids asking more questions if they have them, that lets them know this is an okay thing that you observe. It's okay that there are differences in skin color, and it's okay for us to talk about it. We should also, and that's a very overt situation in which your child asks you a question about race and you have to deal with it, but we should also take advantage of opportunities that arise in our daily lives to talk with our kids about race if it feels relevant. So the books I mentioned before, there are a lot of books that talk about race, or that, that are designed to inspire conversations about race. And I will give you in a minute some website that has some great books. If you're reading a book with your child that brings up issues of race, you want to pause and kind of connect the dots. So if, let's say, two animals in a story are becoming friends, even though they look different, you could say, is there a similar situation you can think of maybe that you've encountered at school? Or, do you ever see people who look different from you on the playground, who might have different colored skin or different hair, but then you play with them and realize you're not so different and that you could actually become friends? And so you actually want to connect the dots and explain kind of explicitly that you're referring to skin color, among other things, when you're referring to differences. Again, this might sound obvious, but white parents really often avoid bringing race into conversations. I remember once I overheard a white child ask his dad what was causing ongoing riots in their city. This was in Chicago. And the dad said, well, the riots are in response to police violence, and kind of gave him a very short and brief answer. But what he omitted to say was that the riots were specifically in response to white on black police violence. And this dad didn't take that opportunity to get into the topic and to talk about the role that race played in the riots, which I felt like was a missed opportunity. Of course, you want to be age appropriate, but kids, you can have conversations about race even with young children. Another way is to use the media as a conduit. This is something I love to do. Like if you're watching a movie together and you notice some kind of racial trope or something playing out, you could pause the movie and talk about it for a minute. So one thing I've noticed watching movies, especially older kids movies, is like the villains often have dark skin and a foreign accent. And this is something that always has bothered me. And so when I see that playing out in a movie, I will pause it and say, did you notice, like, what do you notice about this villain? And we talk about how is it maybe a little bit racist that the villains often have dark skin and a foreign accent? Or maybe you could say, why is it we never see a black Santa Claus? Just like bring up these questions, and they're just kind of like ways to have a conversation about race. And there's no kind of right way to have the conversation, but just to get your child thinking about it. Of course, I do feel like I have to just mention, even though I said I'm mostly talking to white parents here, of course, parents of color also talk to their kids about race. They often do it in a very different way. Just to briefly summarize what some of the research shows, a lot of non-white parents talk to their kids about racial ethnic heritage and history. And this is a great way to foster racial pride. And research has shown that kids of color who have these kinds of conversations with their parents develop a more positive sense of self. One study found that families of color who regularly talked about their culture's values and traditions, their children developed a really strong sense of identity and pride. And they also had higher self-esteem. They were more psychologically healthy, and they actually did better in school. Of course, there's also the fact that a lot of non-white parents or parents of non-white kids may want to explicitly prepare their kids for the possibility of discrimination and teach them how to cope with it, respond to it when it happens. That's another common type of conversation. But it seems as though from the research, the kinds of conversations that parents of color or parents of children of color are having with their kids, they tend to be very protective and helpful. And these parents often just kind of are doing the right thing based on what their instincts are telling them. So that's why I say they don't have as much to learn as white parents do. So that was a lot about like conversations and how we should talk to kids about race. And one more thing I want to add, though, is that we should also be talking about racism and showing our kids how to fight racism. So this is, I mean, it can be really hard to talk to kids about these big issues, and they feel very nuanced and difficult and heavy. But there are ways to do this that are age appropriate. I'm just going to briefly describe one study that shows that talking about discrimination can be actually very helpful and can help reduce prejudice. So researchers presented short biographies to kids of famous people, famous white people and famous Black people. And they did this to elementary aged white kids. And half of the kids were told biographies that discussed the racism and discrimination that the Black individuals had experienced. The other half of the kids heard identical biographies that just omitted the details about the racism and discrimination that the people had experienced. And then afterwards, researchers gave all the children tests that evaluated their racial prejudice. And they found that the kids who learned about the discrimination had more positive attitudes toward Black people than the kids who hadn't learned about discrimination. They also did this study with Black children to see whether learning about discrimination would be difficult for them, how essentially to figure out how it would make them feel, whether it would be beneficial or not. And they did find that Black kids who were taught about discrimination actually were much more satisfied with the lessons. They appreciated them more than the kids who were not given any context about discrimination. Again, I know this is hard and you don't want to scare your children, but you also don't want to sugarcoat or lie. And of course, what you say will depend on how old your children are, how mature they are, what you feel they're ready to hear. But I will just say one thing on that. I don't think kids are ever too young to learn about racism in some form, given that kids of color experience racism from the time they're born. So we, as white parents, get to choose when and where and how we have these conversations, and that is because of our privilege, but parents of color do not have that privilege. And to avoid the topic, just to protect our kids' innocence, is to use white privilege to perpetuate racism. Secondly, when you're talking about racism, one other thing that I think sometimes we do is we kind of frame it as a thing of the past. Like we talk about slavery and then we say, okay, well, now that's over and things are much better and the civil rights movement happened and everything's okay now. And I think I just want to caution that it's helpful actually to tell kids that racism still exists, because kids aren't going to fight an injustice that they don't know still exists. Like, what they need to know that racism is still happening, so that they will learn, they will know to look out for it and to challenge it when they see it. And sometimes kids actually come out with this sort of historic framing as well, and we kind of have to push back against it. So a couple of years ago, on Columbus Day, I talked to my kids about Indigenous Americans and how terribly they've been treated. And my 8-year-old son at the time jumped in with something like, well, back then we weren't nice to Native Americans. And I had to sort of challenge him and say, well, that is true. But also Native Americans and other people of color still are not treated well by many Americans. And we still need to continue to fight for justice and equality. So we should also be listening out for those things that our kids might say that are kind of accurate, but not the whole story. Briefly, I want to mention a couple of resources that you can turn to, because it is hard to talk to kids about these issues. And it's hard to know like what language to use, how to frame it. One website that I really like, it used to be tolerance.org, but now it's just changed to learningforjustice.org. And this is a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And it's designed for teachers and school administrators, but it has free resources that parents can use too. And it's broken down by age group. It has like lessons on different aspects of the civil rights movement and discussions about all sorts of topics. Another website so I love using books to introduce kids to difficult subjects when I don't know exactly how to talk about it. Another website I really like is socialjusticebooks.org. We can put these in the chat as well. That's just a great compilation site that has all sorts of different kinds of social justice books on different topics and also for different age groups. So that's a really nice resource. Also, one other thing I discovered when I was researching my book was a monthly subscription box that is called Little Justice Leaders that I thought was adorable and really well done. This is for kids in kindergarten through 6th grade. And you pay to get basically a box that comes every month that includes a children's book on a particular topic, often related to race, but not always. It has a craft and it has discussion materials for parents on like, here's how to talk to your kid about this difficult issue related to social justice or racism. So I found that also really, really helpful. Back to the issue of like helping your kids learn how to fight racism. I think another really important thing is to model, this is one of the themes of my book, model the behavior you want to see. So if you want your kids to fight against racism, they should see you doing it too. If you see someone saying something racist in public, if you feel like you can, challenge them in the moment in front of your kids. If you feel like you can't do it in the moment, like maybe your mother-in-law said something racist at Thanksgiving and you don't want to ruin the whole meal, you might talk to her about it afterward, ideally again in front of your kids, or at the very least, discuss what she said with your kids later. So you could say something like, I love grandma very much, but I disagree with what she said at dinner last night. Let's talk about it. So just don't let things lie without at least using them as a discussion topic at some point with your kids. And so that they recognize, they see that you are uncomfortable with something that's racist, that's really important. And also so you can have a conversation about it. And through that conversation, you're kind of sharing your values and sharing your worldview. And also, I know the pandemic, it's been hard to do things like bringing your kids to protests, but when we feel safe, that's something great to do. We made yard signs, Black Lives Matter yard signs that we put out, things like that can be really great ways to get your kids involved and have them, understand what it's like to fight racism. I realize it is almost time for me to open up to questions. I just want to say a couple of other small, short things. One is, what should you do if your kid says something racist? Because I think that first example in the supermarket, that wasn't a racist comment. It was more of an observation, but sometimes kids will say something racist and it is really hard. So I just want to give a couple of suggestions. First, take a deep breath and resist the temptation to like lose your mind and scream at your child, because I think it's important to know that a lot of kids, they don't have the skills we think they do. They don't understand the gravity of what they're saying. Sometimes they will hear something and then they will repeat it and they just really don't understand what it means. And so you might start by asking questions. Where did you hear that? What made you say that? And try to really understand, where are they coming from? You know, what did this come from? What do they understand and what do they not understand? And in that way, you kind of think of it as almost like an opportunity to see where your kids are and what you need to address with them. So sometimes those racist comments, as horrible as they make us feel as parents when we hear our kids say them, they are kind of like opportunities to guide our kids and to teach them. And then after you kind of figured out where they are, you will then want to help them understand why what they said is not okay. I talked to some Black primary school educators and mothers for my book, and they have a bunch of little a bunch of booklets that they've put out on like how to talk to kids about race. Education with an Apron is one. Lanisha Tab is one of the women. And then Naomi O'Brien is another. And she has a blog called Read Like a Rock Star, but they've put together these great books. And they suggest saying something like, thank you for being honest. I can understand why you might have thought that, but here's why that's racist and wrong. And then explain. And you really want to be thinking less about your child's, their intention matters in terms of they may not have known what they were saying was hurtful, but you want to emphasize to them that, impact really matters too, that even if you don't intend to be hurtful, your words can really hurt other people. And so you want to kind of make that clear too. Finally, one other thing I just want to say is, I live in a community that is predominantly white. And I think, in that kind of situation, it can be very helpful to do what you can to let your kids experience and enjoy diversity. There's an idea, I think, that some white parents have, that if their kids are growing up in predominantly white communities, they'll be less likely to become racist because they're not seeing race as much. But the research really suggests the opposite, actually. In one study, researchers gave racial bias tests to preschool aged kids, some of whom lived in racially mixed areas and some of whom lived in predominantly white areas. And the kids who lived in white communities were significantly more prejudiced. So if you live in a predominantly white community, that doesn't mean that, that you're doomed. You can do all sorts of things. You can, as I said, read books, watch TV shows and movies with diverse characters. Research shows that actually just watching diverse TV shows that portray like positive interracial friendships can really help kids develop more positive racial attitudes. Also encourage cross-racial friendships. We have to be a little careful here because you don't want to tokenize people of color. You don't want your kid to tell your kid to befriend someone Black just because they're Black. But at the same time, if your child is developing a friendship with someone of a different race, celebrate that and really try to foster that friendship, because friendships, cross-racial friendships are one of the best ways to promote acceptance and to interrupt the development of prejudice. And, bring your kids to places that are diverse when you can. If there's a playground that you can choose that's more diverse, go to that playground, go to that more diverse restaurant. My son, in the year before the pandemic, he went to a camp that was only half white. And he loved it. And when he came home, he was talking about how the diversity was one of the things he loved about it. And I think it was just a really wonderful experience for him. So think about ways that you can, invite diversity into your lives. That can include where you live, of course, and schools that you might choose. With schools, it's a little bit tricky because even diverse schools can sometimes be very segregated on the inside. So ideally, like, you would want a child in a diverse school that's highly integrated, including on a class level. But just think about these things, because those exposures and those experiences also make a really big difference. All right, I'm going to stop now. I will just say, if there's one thing that I'd love for you to take away from this talk, because I know I covered a lot of ground, it's to move out of your comfort zone, to really start trying to have conversations that maybe you've been avoiding, to start, engaging with ideas maybe that you've been avoiding. And don't beat yourself up if you make mistakes. If you say something, you frame it in a way that makes you cringe. Mistakes are part of the process. You can always go back to your kids later and say, you know what, I think I have a better way of talking about this now. So let's talk about it again. You can always revisit conversations later. But if we do want to build a more anti-racist future, I think it's crucial that we really make an effort and we do things that make us uncomfortable. So thank you for listening to all of that. And I will now take your questions.
Thank you so much, Melinda. This was super. And, at some point early on, you said, I hope you don't mind that I'm giving all these studies. And that's such a strength of the book and such a strength of your work, is to draw from all these studies. And I know you've given us a lot in these last 35, 40 minutes, but that's what we want. So thank you for doing that. And I know there are some questions out there. I'll just encourage others, if you've got questions, to type them into the Q&A window. I want to start with one that was submitted early, which is just about the word race, racism, ethnicity. I guess I could see this being somewhat tangential, but how did you look at this? Why do you focus on race and racism? What's the difference in your mind? Are there different races? Talk to us a little about this.
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly a complicated issue and when it comes to vocabulary. And so there, from my understanding, there is no biological difference between races. There's more differences among people of a particular race, how people refer to race, than between different races. So race is largely a social construct. But just because it's a social construct, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist on a level in terms of the experiences that people of different races have. They are treated differently. So, I mean, I don't have when I'm referring to race, I'm really kind of referring to, I think, skin color more than anything else. Because these are things that children especially can see these differences and respond to them. But in terms of, are there actually biologically different races? No, it's just that people with different skin colors are treated differently based on the color of their skin. And so those differences that are sort of perceived are what I'm referring to, even if they are not biologically relevant. I don't know if that makes sense. I think
100%, yeah. I have to say, I'm reminded of I had a professor in graduate school by the name of Barbara Fields, a wonderful historian. And I always remember she said, there's no such thing as race, there's only racism. And I've always felt that, as you say, race, we know it's a social construct. We know the differences are not biological. There are more differences between you and me than there are between me and an African-American man. But it's racism that we're really talking about. We're talking about the impact of the differences that we perceive. And right. That you get to that. Okay, the other question, this is a little bit of a divergence, but I just got to ask you about the title of the book. I mean, you could have made it How to Make Your Kids Nice, How to Make Better Kids, but no, you went with the A word there. So could you tell us a little about that?
Yeah. Well, I have to say the title of the book is what came to me first before actually I'd really even conceived of the whole concept of the book. I was out with my husband and I was just thinking about the state of the world and worried about my kids, as I was saying at the beginning. And I honestly blurted out, maybe I should just write a book called How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Assholes. And it stuck. I think there was something about it. I mean, yes, it's provocative and it's attention grabbing. And certainly there is an element of this might sell books based on just the title alone, but it also captured what I was really after. I mean, yes, my book is about raising kind kids, but really my book is a reaction to the state of affairs right now and me just being worried and frustrated. And I feel like that worry and frustration comes out in the title, and I thought it might appeal to other parents who were having these similar kind of fears about, oh my God, what is the world becoming? What are my kids growing up? What world are they growing up in? What are they going to become? How do we change this? So it's framed in this way, I think, to reach those parents who are feeling that same sort of exasperation and worry. And when there were a lot of discussions about whether we should change the title with my publisher, and a lot of, just so many discussions. And I tried to come up with other titles that I thought would really capture the nuances well, but I couldn't. We had so many: How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Jerks, How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Monsters, and nothing quite really captured what I think is the connotation of asshole. And when I talked to other parents as I was writing the book and I said, this is the running title, they were like, that's a lot of parents said, that's the perfect title. I think you need to stick with it because it really is like specific in a way that I think that will reach and speak to other parents. And so that's why I stuck with it. But I understand it's a provocative title and some people really don't like it. And I completely understand that. And I respect that. And I know I'm going to alienate some people because of it, but I just felt like for the benefits of what it captured and what it really like, what it said on some level outweighed those detriments.
Understood. I think early in your book, you talk about just the relative power of parents. And I just wondered if I could ask you to talk a little about it here. But you've talked obviously about the influence of parents and these ideas of what we can do for our children. But we also know there are other influences, right? There are their kids, there's the school, there's what's on the internet, there's nature versus nurture. So where does parenting fit in? Are we able to shape our children?
Yeah, I think this is the $1 million question, to what degree can parents actually shape who their children become? And there isn't a single clear answer to that. What I will say though, having read hundreds of studies that specifically look at how different parenting approaches affect kids and how parenting interventions will, will affect the same child over time, it is very clear that how we parent does affect our kids, even when they get to be tweens and teens. There's been some longitudinal studies that have really tried to tease out the effects of peers and parents and other things. And it is really hard to do and nobody can do it perfectly. But they have come to the conclusion that, yes, peers matter, especially in the teen years, and all sorts of other things matter, of course. And of course we have, genetics and we have hormones and we have neurotransmitters. I mean, there's just so many things that are shaping our kids, their experiences outside the home, what their school life is like. So there's lots of things that are influencing kids, but we do know from the studies that have really tried to tease it out that parents do matter. They do make a difference. If a parent changes how they parent based on an intervention, even among kids who are a little bit older, they nevertheless can see changes in the kids. Like kids respond to the way parents parent, even when parents have been, parenting in one way for a long time and then make a change, they respond to the change. So I think it's really heartening. It gives me hope as a parent, because I feel like I'm always worried about what are all the things that are out of my control, like, and what effect are those having on my kids? And having looked through all this research, I feel pretty confident that we can make a difference. We can make a positive
difference. And you write
difference.
in your book a little about how, I thought it was great. You're like, I'm not the perfect parent. My kids are not the perfect kids. And so there's a level of humility in what you write. But you also said that as you did more research, it affected you, right? It affected the way you parent and you saw an impact on the way your kids were behaving, right?
Yes, absolutely. I will say it took a little time. I had to kind of, I think, digest what I had learned. I think parenting, a lot of it's reactive and emotional. And sometimes when our kids challenge us or, do something that is difficult for us, we don't always respond in a rational way because we're kind of almost triggered by them. But over time, as I kind of let these things that I learned seep in, I definitely changed how I parent. And I have definitely seen changes in my kids as well. And it's sometimes it's subtle things, but I do feel like, on the whole, I have a lot more conversations with my kids about things that I didn't think to have conversations with them about more. I'm kind of more explicit in the things I talk about, and I don't avoid a lot of awkward topics that in addition to race, there's all sorts of awkward topics to talk about with kids, right? Sex and pornography and all these things. I have more conversations. I also just feel that I'm a little bit more of a patient and empathetic mother because I think about things differently. Like when my kids do something that's difficult for me, I have a different mindset now when it happens. And I think that helps me respond to it differently. And that's based on all the research that I did for the book.
Just to touch on what you just said, the book is much more than about racism and combating racism, right? And yes, you said you talk about pornography, you talk about your kids or children and what they're exposed to online and how to deal with that. You talk about combating bullying and sexism and selfishness and self-esteem. You do a whole lot. For this talk, you were narrowing it down, but the book, for everybody out there, the book really does cover much more than just racism. There's a question that came in that I don't remember seeing this in your book, but let's just get your response to it. And this is about, are there studies about parents who are white supremacists and their efforts to sustain racism? And, do those studies suggest something else that fits into this story?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have not seen studies that have specifically tried to include white supremacist parents. That would be really interesting and informative. I mean, we know from a lot of the research on parenting that kids learn based on what we say and do. I mean, what we model matters. So I would absolutely guess that children of very racist, outwardly racist parents are going to become racist themselves because they are absorbing those comments that their parents are making and whatever else their parents are doing. But I have not seen like actual research showing that to be true. That's just my assumption based on other things that I've read. Yeah.
I know that in our museum, it's a little bit different, but we have a children's book that was published in 1936 by a supporter of the Nazi Party, and that encouraged anti-Semitism and really teaches anti-Semitism. And it's like 40
Wow.
pages of beautiful color pictures with nice ruddy-faced children, and all of the pictures, when you look close at them, they're encouraging German kids to treat Jewish kids differently. And they're making anti-Semitism a normative, acceptable behavior. So that's different, but I'm sure there are children's books out there that do that kind of thing still, and which sustain racism. And I always feel like it's the lesson from the Holocaust is that it's actually not hard to teach hate. That's
Yeah.
that's in us, and that what you really got to work hard to do is to combat that and to teach love and to teach respect, and that we got to work hard at that. So I know that's what
Yeah.
you're doing as well. Um, Let me ask you about one other thing, which is it struck me. You talk about how one example of how your kids, you asked them to participate in a study of some sort where they
Mm,
were talking about or reacting to children's faces, I think it was, and
yeah.
what it taught you about you. Would you share that with us?
Yes, actually, this is, I planned to talk about this in tonight's talk, and then I realized, oh goodness, this talk is getting long, and I cut it short. Yes, so there was a study that my kids participated in during the pandemic where they looked at pictures of kids of different races, and they answered questions about like who they would want to be friends with. And I was nervous, of course, that my kids were going to say, oh, I don't want to be friends with the kids who have brown or black skin. They didn't they didn't say that, but what the last question that was asked was of my kids was, who do you think your parents would want you to be friends with? And my kids chose white children. And this was a big wake up call for me. I was aghast. I was mortified. I didn't want to bring it up in the moment with them. And, I'd encourage them to be honest. And I didn't want to sort of make them feel like they had done something wrong by answering that honestly. But it definitely triggered kind of a period of self-reflection and self-education for me, because I couldn't help but think, what is it that I am doing as a parent that is somehow communicating to my children that I want them to only hang out with white kids? There must be something I'm doing. And there is research that really looks at kind of the subconscious or unconscious ways that we communicate things, like the body language that we have around people of color could be different, and our kids pick up on that. Was it that I don't have a lot of friends of color, in part because of where I live? Like, were they kind of inferring because I don't hang out with a lot of people who aren't white that they shouldn't either? And I don't know exactly, but what this led me to do was really to educate myself. I read a bunch of books. So some of my favorites, So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo is wonderful. Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad is very good. How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram Kendi's book. And I'm now actually reading Biased by Jennifer Eberhardt, which is really fantastic. And it really looks at like implicit biases. And these books really just help me like understand some of the ways in which we can have implicit biases and sort of support white supremacy in ways that we do not realize we're doing. And really like how we also like communicate to others how we feel in these sort of unconscious ways. And so it really helped me think a lot about myself and what I'm doing and, what I need to be doing and what I need to be thinking about and working on. And I highly recommend that other parents do this too, because I think if we do want to raise anti-racist kids, like we have to resolve whatever kind of hidden racial issues we might have as well and address them. Yeah, thank you for asking that, because I did want to talk about that.
Yeah. I see that. I know we're running out of time. I wanted to say one thing, which is just to endorse your call to have difficult conversations and to get into these topics that where we are uncomfortable. And I know that our educational programs at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, we do a program called Courageous Conversations that is often done with teachers or PTA groups or parent groups. And it starts with just saying, we're going to talk about the things you don't talk about, the things that when they come up, you generally say, let's not talk about that, and get into some of those topics because they are difficult. And even some of the things, that you shared today, obviously uncomfortable to hear. And, but that doesn't mean, as you said, it doesn't mean we should shy away from them. In fact, there's really a need to get into them. So not that you need my endorsement, but that's what the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center is certainly on the same page on some of that stuff. There is one last question. I want to just get to it in case we can still fit it in, which is Kevin writes, regarding that study that you mentioned, does the speaker think that if you perform the same question to Black kids, that they would answer in the same, meaning Black kids would say their parents would want them to hang out with other kids? I think this is the study that you had your kids. I think he's referring to the one your kids were participating in. And is there something that looks at how Black kids are looking, or Black children are looking at similar photos and how they're judging them?
Yeah, that study that my kids participated in, I don't think it's been published yet. And I imagine that might have been part of what they looked at. I'm sure, they obviously asked the children who participated, or they asked the parents in advance, maybe what, whether they were white or Black or, what their ethnicity and race were. So I imagine, if every child got the same questions, then Black children were asked that question as well. And I don't think it's been published. So I'm really not sure. It will be very interesting to see what those results show and if there is a difference between white kids and non-white kids in terms of what kind of thing they say. Yeah, it's an interesting
but
question.
You said there have been other studies. I remember you referred to this as well, and you touched on it earlier, which is that sometimes non-white children will feel a pro-white bias.
Yes.
Because of social conditions
or
things that they're seeing, just like white kids are seeing a pro-white bias.
Yes, right. And we think that reflects the kind of high status bias that they, Black kids see that whites have more power and status, and then they respond to that by, thinking of themselves as inferior and preferring people who are white to people who are Black. Yeah, it could be, that certainly could play a role too in how Black kids might answer these questions. That has high status bias might make a difference. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you again, Melinda, for joining us and sharing your expertise with us. I want to encourage people to find a copy of this book, really a lot in there. And I would just say there's the first section is all these traits, and you've really been talking about those traits section as you talked this evening. And then there's a strategies section where you really give some great ideas about how to concretely to how to get into some parenting and how to maybe make some changes. So very, very great book. Love it. And anyway, so thanks everybody else for joining us. And I hope you have a lovely evening. And I hope to see everybody at some of our other programs soon. So thanks very much, Melinda. Have a good night.
Thank you so much. Take care. Thanks everyone for coming. Really appreciate it.